It is an evil place, the horrors of which none can imagine. What is known about the northern regime is what you cannot fathom happening in a modern state. Governments know about what goes on there, especially the Chinese government, but they do nothing because they choose not to. The American government knows some of what occurs in the north, but are unable to help because of political agendas. The southern government of Korea knows in the worst way possible, through attacks from a desperate north struggling to survive and people escaping from that hell for their very lives. The northern regime was not originally meant to exist. There was a United Nations charter for the two divided portions of Korea to once again become a single country. But politics and situations at the end of the Second World War prevented this, and the peninsula was occupied by the Soviet, later Russian, and American armies. Both superpowers installed governments which looked favorably toward their own interests. When the North was established, it was totalitarian. The South was authoritarian. Nearly no difference between the two. The difference was that in the North, the communist practice of the cult identity was applied for its leader, as well as the regime wanting to control every aspect of its people's lives. The people thought that the government would really help them. Korea had been under dynastic rule for thousands of years and had been nearly wiped from global existence by the Japanese. They wanted a new form of government, but little did they know that the regime would be arguably even worse. It was around this point where concrete evidence as to what really happens in that region stops. What the world knows of the regime dates from Chinese, Korean, Russian, American, and Japanese governmental findings, as well as my personal conversations from Koreans who had family flee from that region. When the border was set up between the two so-called countries, there was a zone established where neither nation's armies could have influence over, a sort of neutral ground, the demilitarized zone, the DMZ as it's called. But almost immediately the North wanted to gain an upper hand over the South through any means possible. Even to this day, no one is sure as to the reasons for the Northern regime acting the way it does towards the South. There is constant spying. There have even been people abducted from the South to the North, possibly for information as to how the country functions and military conflict between the two sides. This has been seen by some as desperate actions by a jealous North over a happy and prosperous South. On the government level, the North is very secret. What is known about the North is that it is completely obsessed with remaining in power, even at the cost of its own people. Standard practice for a communist government. Everything is designed toward keeping party officials in their positions of status and the ideologies of communism in everyday life and the cult personification of its leader constantly being reminded to the people. This is publicly known in the regime's constitution. Few foreign governments want anything to do with the regime as well. The only real relations it has are with the Chinese and Russian governments. Essentially, the two reasons why the regime is still in power and millions upon millions upon millions of Koreans have suffered unfathomable pain and suffering. The Chinese and Russian governments never wanted a democratic and developed Korean nation bordering them. It's been theorized that it would jeopardize their own geopolitical intentions within the region of Northeast Asia, China most of all, because according to Korean documents and government sources, Northeast China is ancestral Korean land. A powerful Korea may want these lands back, or at least some territorial changes. To keep this from happening, the Chinese government has propped up the northern regime for decades. But recent leaked American intelligence has proven that the communist mainland government is growing tired of the North's constant problems and unpredictable nature. The only thing that the southern government and the American government can do is provide food aid. The Chinese and Japanese governments do as well. I can imagine it has to do with guilt on some level. As seen from food famines in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the government does not actually give the food aid to the people. Rather, they keep it for themselves and give what's left over to the people. Footage from these famines seen on Japanese television show dead Koreans in the streets and the soldiers and government uncaring. Dead bodies were simply covered with sheets or rags so no one could see. It's obvious due to the brainwashing and constant cult leader propaganda that no one would care anyway. Reports are coming out increasingly that the people are actually resorting to cannibalism in order to survive. Rumors and accounts have mentioned parents killing their children for their quote-unquote meat, and people even digging up deceased family members to consume their rotting flesh as a source of food. Officially, the regime has not commented on such accusations. Privately, world governments expect even worse. Older generations want the country to be reunified at any cost, due to some of them being alive during the Japanese occupation, or some of them even being born in the northern regions of Korea. That was the last time when the country was whole. Most younger and modern generations have grown up in a divided nation. These younger generations of people want reunification, but they themselves have personal problems and living their lives to deal with. Some even do not want reunification due to the countless problems that it might bring, such as rehabilitating a traumatized population, repairing the environment which has been destroyed, and uncovering any other hideous secrets as of this moment is not known to the outside world. A very close friend of mine once called North Korea, quote-unquote, evil Chosun, a reference to the dynasty that ruled before the Japanese occupation, the last dynasty in Korean history. I corrected her when she said the North is evil and it has nothing to do with the noble Chosun dynasty. She thought for a moment about it, then nodded in agreement with what I had said.